All right, let's talk about UX principles. This is going to be one of the most important videos I've ever put out, and I've put out well over 1,000. So pay attention. Take out your nerd notepad and take notes because you're going to learn now about the most important thing in modern day web design, modern day web development, modern day development in general, whether it be iOS, Android, Windows stick apps, Mac apps, websites, web apps. This stuff is super important and it separates the successful companies in technology versus the not so successful. So let's talk about UX principles. First of all, what is UX? UX is nerd short for user experience. It's related to UI, which is user interface design. UX has to do with how easy a piece of software is to use, whether it be a website, a web app, whether it be your Android device, Android software, etc. UI is how it looks, how pretty it is, the aesthetics of it. Now, let's look at a couple examples of UX and UI, and you'll see the reason I'm going to go over this. So let's look at, for instance, Google. Google, what is it, the most traffic site in the world? Its user interface, the beauty of its interface is, well, it's pretty much not there. It isn't ugly, but it isn't beautiful either. It's just very, 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 very simple. Another example, a super successful but super simple looking site in terms of user interface, Craigslist, just a bunch of text links. Now, there's two reasons why these websites and these products are highly successful or uber successful. It's because A, they provide a key functionality. Google is the best search out there, and Craigslist is just a really good, classified site. But the other major reason why it's so successful is because they have really good UX, real good user experience, meaning the sites are obvious and simple to use. In modern day development, UX and UI are super important. Back in the 90s and up until the early 2000s, the hurdles were a lot of hurdles rather in software development, in the actual architectures. There's a lot of hurdles in just being able to do something. Things like, I always use this example, back in the 90s I was involved in this project working for a publicly traded company, and we needed a calendar picker to work in a web app. It could just be able to, so people could select a date. This was a huge thing, and I remember my friend who was on the team, he spent 2 weeks developing a calendar picker, 2 weeks, with JavaScript, HTML, and that worked on both Internet Explorer and Netscape. In those days, the DOMs, the document object models of these two browsers, the two most popular browsers, they didn't play nice together. So it was a real pain to write something as simple as a calendar picker. These days, you go click, boom, bang. Scaling was an issue back in those days as well because server computers were not nearly as powerful. The infrastructures or the frameworks that you had access to, what little ones you had, weren't nearly as capable as they are today. So scaling was much more of an issue back then as it is today. These days, scaling and just basic functionality, whether you want pickers and sorting and all this kind of stuff and dynamic charting, this is all easily done. It's not such a big deal. So what separates the successful apps from the not so successful apps is whether or not you have a really good UX and a pretty decent UI. Again, UX is user experience, UI is user interface. UX means how easy it is to use. UI, user interface, is how nice it looks. What I used to teach people who used to, my developers, people who used to work for me and designers, I used to say, when you're developing the website, when you're developing the web app, the screens that people see, whether it be a website or a web app or any type of app really, you have to look at that screen and feel it. I used to say, what is the emotional snapshot of the page? We'll talk about websites, we'll talk about web apps. So what is the emotional snapshot? What do I mean by that? What I meant by that is when you first look at the site when you come to it, or the web app when you come to it, does it seem busy? Does it seem relaxing? Does it make sense to you right away? Or do you have to think about what you got to do to get anything done on this website. This is key, this initial emotional reaction. And this plays a big role in terms of whether or not people are going to actually even give your app a try. If they come to a website or they come to a web app or they launch your app in their smartphone and it's difficult to figure out even to do simple things, people are going to get frustrated and people are going to go, boom, they're going to leave. You're going to get a drop off. So that's where UX comes into play. Now, user interface, how aesthetic it looks, how pretty it is, initially is as important as UX, because when you come to a site, it looks good, nice imagery, and nice alignment, where you basically follow tried and true graphic design principles in terms of what makes a page, what makes a view look nice. That is initially, for like the first 10, 20 seconds, important, but then that falls away very quickly, and UX, how usable it is, how easy it is to understand, becomes far more important. And going forward, the usability is far more important than how pretty it is. I'm emphasizing here how important UX is. When I first learned how to do UX was actually through my graphic design training back when I was in high school. I did a 2-year program in graphic design. And then when I was in my product days of my first business, I had water purification products that you'd put into jars. And there's a certain level of complexity in using these products properly. So I had a label. And if I can find the label, I'll superimpose it on my face here in the video. And you'll see on the label, there's a small little spot I had where I had to put the instructions so that people would be able to just read the instruction very quickly, be able to understand how to use the product effectively and easily. And it was very important for sales that this was clear and understandable. So I used to call it my labeling haiku, where I had to write out the instructions, and like I had like 50, I had 50 words I had to put in. It was kind of like a Twitter. It's like it was way before Twitter, but it's kind of like Twitter, being able to craft a tweet in a very, a limited number of characters. I had to do this on labels, right? Because labels had to be a certain size, and it had to be concise. And I worked on these for a whole bunch of products, and it helped me to become much more refined in my writing style. And this carried over, I think, into my UX work when I started building websites in the early 1990s and web apps, where I was always thinking in those terms as well, about simplicity, getting to the point as quickly as possible. In behavioral psychology, they talk about something called cognitive load. Cognitive, your cognition, your thinking, and the load, how much weight you're putting on it. So this has everything to do with UX, so bear with me. You're going to learn a bit of psychology now. Our brains are constantly scanning the environment, like constantly, like taking in information like crazy through all our senses, through sight, through hearing, through smells, etc. And most of the data is coming in through our eyes, by the way. And there's so much information it's got to process. And the brain is constantly putting bits of information into hierarchies. It's saying, okay, this is important, we better pay attention to this. This is not so important, let's not pay attention to that. Oops. So the brain has limited capacity, right? Our brains or computers, there's processors, it has limited capability, so it's always trying to be efficient in terms of how it's scanning the environment and processing information. The number one thing it's looking for are dangers, things that could kill us. Rustling in the bush, that could be a predator. It pays very much attention to that. That's why in politics they use fear all the time to drive people. They want to drive fear because politicians know and the marketers know that fear is the biggest driver. Our brains, in fact, they're designed to overemphasize dangers, because if you get eaten, it doesn't matter if you eat or you pick up later on. It doesn't matter if you're dead because you got eaten by a predator or you fell off a cliff. Everything else is secondary. So our brains have a tendency to overemphasize fear. Just a little tip there. That's why anxieties come, and you get these crazy anxieties sometimes, or you get these fears based on that are over-exaggerated. So try to relax when you're feeling a little anxious, a little fearful about something. Consider that our brain magnifies potential dangers artificially. Not all the time, but a lot of times. Anyhow, so our brains are constantly trying to reduce the load of information that's coming in by pushing things into categories, if you will, into different, this is important, this is not important. And so that's why we tend to be resistant to change, because our brains don't want new things to process, right? Because it's going out, we got to process something new, we don't want this. So think about all that. So let's come back to a user interface, whether a website, a web app, or a smartphone app. And you're in a situation where you come to a new app, and if it looks complex, your brain's like, oh, that's too much. This extra cognitive load. I got to worry about whether a lion's going to eat me. I don't want to learn something new. So there's resistance. So good UX is about reducing cognitive load, reducing elements in your app, in your page that forces the brain to have to do extra work for nothing. You can do some obvious big things to reduce the initial, obvious big things that could increase cognitive load unnecessarily, which causes people to not want to use your piece of software, not want to use your website. There's also many little things that you could do. So let's say you got your web app. We'll talk about web apps, websites. So you just got your website. And let's say you got 20 little things that are a little off. Each little thing in of itself is nothing. But if you have 20 little things, it adds up to increased cognitive load. Your brain says this is too busy, there's too much to take in. I don't like it. You start feeling like you don't like it, and you move on. I'm working on now Studio Web 4, the final phases, where now I'm in there hammering it, especially in terms of UX. I'm going there looking for little inconsistencies in the way the UI is presented, things that creep in, even though we have a very refined game plan, if you will, because we're basing this off of our 7 years of development with the previous version of Studio Web, where a lot of work has been put into the UX to begin with. But nonetheless, I'm going in there looking for these little things, these little niggles that would contribute to cognitive load. I'll give you an example, very simple example. If your buttons are green on one page, they should be green on all the pages. You don't want to have people thinking, okay, buttons are green, and then on another page, you make the buttons orange. This is a very simple example, but you're adding, and it's not such a big thing, but imagine you got 20 other little things where you got these inconsistencies. It starts to add up, right? It's like one little thing, like different color button, that's just one poke, right? But if you got two things there, it's just, it starts to become substantial in terms of the cognitive load if you got all these little things bugging you, right? One poke doesn't do much, but boom, 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 that does a lot. So when you're developing your websites, you got to go in there and you got to start scanning for all these things to reduce cognitive load. Another thing you could do, for instance, is just having a consistent capitalization structure. So let's say you got menu items in text, right? And I've seen it where sometimes they'll use camel case, so it'll be like a capital in the first letter and a capital in the second letter, and it'll be stuck together. And then sometimes in another menu item, it will be just capital in the first letter and the second words will be all lowercase. On their own, these little things are not much, but if you add them all up, it starts to add up. It starts to add up and it starts to create cognitive load. So one of the big things, what you're doing as a UX designer is you're reducing cognitive load using the principles of UX design. By the way, good UX designers are rare. Bigger companies understand that these people are extremely valuable, extremely valuable. Now remember, UX is not about the aesthetics necessarily. It's not really about that. It's about how easy it is. Now you can look at user experience. It goes beyond just the software. Right now I'm a camera guy. I have my cinema camera here. I'm looking at cameras. And one of the things that I see with this professional camera that I bought is that the controls are much more ergonomic. The UX, essentially, the user experience, is much better with the professional gear. All the buttons are all accessible. They all make sense. They're laid out in a way that makes sense in terms of your typical workflow. So one of the big advantages of using the cinema camera, besides that it's got a superior image, but a bigger advantage is because it's got superior ergonomics, superior UX, it's actually much easier to use. It's much more productive. You get a much better workflow. You get much more done. So it's worth a lot more money than the prosumer camera that may have a fairly good image, but because all the ergonomics are buried in the camera submenus, it's a lot harder to work with. It's a lot harder to get anything done. So let me end off this video on UX with some UX tips. Just four. Now I could do a whole course on this, but I'm just going to give you four. So number one, you want to have consistent user interface elements. So you're talking the color of your buttons, the color of your text. You want to have consistent nomenclature, how you name things and so on. In terms of button elements, user interface elements, you want to keep the shapes consistent. Well, you want to have visual cues amongst your UI elements that tell the viewer that this is a UI element related to this or that or the other thing. It's kind of a vague, but just think about consistent UI elements, color, text, shapes, etc. That's the first step. Number two, I already mentioned this, you want to reduce cognitive load by reducing many little niggles. Again, these little things that I talked about individually are not much, but altogether they add up to a lot. Number three, this is one of my pet peeves, localized dialog boxes. I see it all the time with apps where you click a button and a dialog box appears up here. No. If you click a button, the dialog box should be front and center. Why? Because that's what's happening now. That's what's important. And I remember I've been on apps or I've been on websites where you'd figure by now people would have figured this out. I click on something and it's like, why isn't it working? Why isn't it working? And up in the corner, they spawned a box that I didn't recognize. Like, come on, guys. Bring the box here. Localized dialog box. You click on an area, the dialog box should be near where you clicked or in the center of the screen so it's very obvious. Again, simple tip, but some people forget about these things. And finally, something I call breathing space. Breathing space. I tell this to my developers. I said, more breathing space, more breathing space. Don't squinch up your dialog boxes. Don't squish up all your text. Don't have dialogue, don't have like a line of text and then have a dialog box appear so it's like it's right on top of it. Give it some breathing space. Give it some space. Everybody likes nice space, breathing space. If somebody sees a cluttered UI where everything else squished together, you feel constrained like this. Breathing space with your elements. All right, that's my first few tips on my first few UX tips rather. I hope you found this useful, and my experience tells me that this is super important. After these are like, this is one of the pillars, one of the foundational concepts, if you will, things that you got to understand if you want to become a successful web designer or a successful developer. All right, I hope you found this useful. Bye-bye.